You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. A middle-aged mother named Kay was fast asleep in a remote forest in Indonesia when she heard her phone ring. Her hand drifted over to the nightstand by her bed, but by the time she grabbed her phone, the call had gone to voicemail. When Kay looked at the screen, she felt a bolt of fear. She had 2 obviously urgent text messages as well as 3 missed calls, all from her sister in Hawaii. And in the text messages, her sister was trying to tell Kay that her son had a fast-moving infection that actually could kill him, and so she needed to get home right now. Kay's trip to Indonesia to work on a farm had been her adventure of a lifetime, but now all she could think about was her son. 2 days and 6,000 miles of travel later, Kay finally arrived by her son's bedside, and she was shocked at what she saw. When she had left for Indonesia, her son had been this healthy, tanned, surfer young man, and now he was sickly looking with a tangle of wires and tubes coming off of every part of his body. As Kay began to cry, she kept asking the same question. How could this have happened? From Ballin Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballin, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please stop by the Follow Button's house while they're cleaning, and then kindly offer to dust off all their furniture. Once they say yes, open up the vacuum and empty all of its contents all over their furniture, and then leave. This episode is called Surf's Up. It was the afternoon of December 24th, 2008, and while most residents of Hilo, Hawaii were celebrating Christmas Eve, 23-year-old Graham McCumber was just getting home from a long day of construction work. Graham backed his pickup truck into his driveway, but he didn't go inside his home. Instead, he stayed just long enough to grab his surfboard, put it in his truck, and then zoom off towards the ocean a few minutes away. Surfing was the only thing that helped Graham unwind after 8 hours of hoisting building materials at a construction site. Graham drove with the windows down on the balmy evening, taking in the smell of sea salt as he pulled into his usual parking spot. He spent a few minutes wrestling on his wetsuit, then he grabbed his board and ran toward the water. Graham surfed until dusk had settled over the beach, feeling all the stress of the day melting away. Then he paddled to shore, toweled himself off, and hopped back in his truck. By the time he got home, it was already dark, and he realized he was running late. A friend had asked him to join a holiday potluck dinner, and he still had to make something, and so he didn't have much time. Graham jumped in the shower, and then afterwards he went outside to the large garden behind his house. Graham had planted this garden with his mom, whose name was Kay. Normally, Kay lived with him at the house, but she was working on an organic farming project in the remote forests of Indonesia. Like his mom, Graham preferred an organic and holistic lifestyle and loved growing his own food. He even practiced herbal medicine like his mom and wanted to be a healer someday. And Graham just loved to share the fruits and veggies from the garden. So he harvested a few bunches of kale, then threw together a salad, and dashed off to the Christmas Eve dinner party. Graham would spend the evening laughing and celebrating the holiday with friends, and then when he got home and climbed into bed, he felt great. The next morning, though, on Christmas Day, Graham woke up with a splitting headache, even though he had not drunk any alcohol at the party the night before. He lay in bed without moving for a few minutes, and slowly the throbbing subsided. He rolled out of bed and stood to get dressed, but then his arm started to itch. And so he began to scratch it, but just as he did, another itch began on his leg. Soon, Graham felt itchy all over his body, but when he checked the spots that itched, there was no visible rash of any kind on his skin. And no matter how hard he scratched every spot, there was just no relief. Graham had never felt this way before, and it made him really anxious. He wished he could talk to his mom and ask her advice, because she would know what bundle of herbs to chew or what tea to drink, but obviously she was gone in Indonesia. However, his mother's sister, Aunt Lynn, she knew a lot about holistic cures too. So he called her, and she told him to come over right away. And so Graham grabbed his car keys and headed out the door, itching himself the whole time. The drive to Lynn's took about 15 minutes, but today it felt like an eternity for Graham. By the time he arrived, Graham's arms and legs were bright red from all the scratching he was doing, and his stomach was starting to churn. He felt like he was going to throw up. He let himself in through the front door and called out to his aunt. She came in from the kitchen with a concerned look on her face, just as Graham collapsed onto the couch. Lynn asked Graham to tell him how he was feeling, and he told his aunt that the itching all over his body felt like it was actually under his skin, and so he just couldn't actually itch it. And he said his stomach felt like it was being twisted into knots. Lynn quizzed him on what he'd eaten or touched over the past 24 hours, but Graham assured her that he hadn't done anything new and was not allergic to anything he'd touched or eaten at the potluck. Lynn thought for a moment, and then she told Graham she'd be right back. Graham closed his eyes and tried to relax as his aunt went outside to her garden. A few moments later, Aunt Lynn came back with a handful of peppermint and some other herbs for his stomach and headache. Graham had used these traditional remedies before, and in the past they had given him some comfort. And so he thanked his aunt and took what she had given him, and then after a while, once he felt like his stomach was settling down, he said goodbye to his aunt and headed home to try to get some rest. When Graham got home, he flopped into his bed and closed his eyes. But although his stomach was feeling better and his headache was gone, the itching had now turned into a deep burning sensation. It felt like his blood vessels were on fire, and the throbbing in his temple had come back. It was a dull pain while Graham was lying down, but the moment he stood up, it felt like someone was driving an ice pick into his forehead. That afternoon, he called his aunt back to ask if he could spend the night at her house. He was in a lot of pain and wanted someone close by in case something bad happened. She agreed to drive over and pick him up. After a very uncomfortable car ride, Graham shuffled his way into Aunt Lynn's guest bedroom. He climbed into her bed and fell asleep instantly, sleeping through the night. The next morning, December 26th, Graham woke up with a shooting pain in his temple. It was so strong, a wave of nausea rose up in his throat. Graham ran to the bathroom and barely made it to the toilet before he threw up. Moments later, Aunt Lynn was kneeling next to him, rubbing his back as he hung his head over the toilet bowl. His aunt's hand on his back made Graham feel a bit better, and he asked her if she wouldn't mind making him some ginger tea because he thought that might help too. And Graham was surprised when he heard his aunt say no. And then he felt his aunt pat his back one more time before she stood up and told him that as much as she and the rest of their family believed in these traditional remedies, it was now time to go to the hospital. About an hour later, Lynn tried to hide her worry as she helped Graham walk into the emergency room at the Hilo Medical Center. And as Graham sat down on a chair along the wall, Lynn felt helpless because she could see that Graham was in so much pain he was now crying. Lynn had never seen her healthy, athletic nephew so sick. She tried her best to appear calm as she checked him in at the reception desk. Then she took a seat next to Graham and filled out his paperwork for him. She actually knew his medical information by heart because they were very, very close. She was essentially his second mom. After a short wait, the receptionist called Graham's name, and a nurse helped him stand up and then walked him through the doors into the patient area. Lynn sat in the waiting room for about 30 minutes before a nurse came out and invited her to come see Graham. When Lynn walked into the exam room, a doctor was in the middle of explaining that they were still waiting for some tests to come back. Once he had those results, he'd have a better idea of what was going on with Graham. Lynn could see Graham grimace. He told the doctor he was in a ton of pain, like a level 10 out of 10, if not higher. He asked if there was anything they could give him for the pain while he waited. The doctor hesitated, then said if Graham's pain was really that bad, they could start him on a morphine drip. Morphine is a very, very strong painkiller. Graham immediately nodded yes. If it would make the pain go away, he wanted it. Lynn was shocked. Morphine was a serious drug, but she knew how much pain Graham was in and understood why it could be necessary. Aunt Lynn gave her nephew a comforting smile and then sent a text to Graham's mother, Kay, letting her know that her son was sick. But they were at the hospital and Graham was getting cared for, and Lynn promised Kay that she would update her if Graham got any worse. A few hours later, Lynn was walking back from the vending machines when she saw Graham's doctor approach his bed. Lynn felt relieved, assuming they must have a diagnosis, and so she walked over, and she asked the doctor if she should go home now and maybe grab an overnight bag for Graham. But the doctor told her that wouldn't be necessary. He said all the tests came back negative, he thought that Graham simply had a serious case of the flu, and he was going to discharge him. Lynn couldn't believe what she was hearing. She reminded the doctor that Graham's pain was so intense that he was put on morphine. Once it wore off, she was worried he'd just end up right back at the hospital. Lynn could see the doctor was skeptical. She wondered if maybe he thought Graham was faking his pain to get a morphine fix. And so she assured the doctor that Graham was a really good kid and was in legitimate pain and just needed help. The doctor promised Lynn that he believed Graham was in severe pain, but his symptoms were consistent with just a bad flu and did not require further treatment at the hospital. He was pretty sure Graham would be better in a couple of days, but he told Lynn to bring him back if he did take a turn for the worse. Lynn disagreed, but there was nothing she could do. The ER was discharging Graham, and she had to take him home. So Lynn waited while Graham signed a few release forms and then helped him back to the car. Once they were back at her house, Lynn helped Graham ease onto the couch, and then she handed him the TV remote. Then she threw his favorite blanket over him and made him the ginger tea he'd asked for earlier. Then she watched with worry as Graham barely sipped his tea and then complained that his head was still hurting and that his arms were starting to itch a little bit. Lynn had no idea what was wrong with her nephew, but she was pretty sure that Graham was suffering from something that was far more serious than the flu, and whatever it was, holistic remedies might not be enough to cure it. She just hoped that he would start to feel better overnight. But the next morning, when Lynn woke up, she heard Graham crying out for help from the guest bathroom. Lynn ran to the bathroom and knocked on the door and asked what was wrong, and from the other side of the door, Graham said that his bladder felt really full, but he couldn't urinate. Then, in a more quiet voice, Graham said he felt like he was dying. Lynn knew that Graham was right to be worried. If he couldn't relieve himself, his bladder could literally burst. A ruptured bladder can lead to blood infection, kidney failure, and even death. And so Lynn told Graham that they were getting back in the car, going back to the hospital, and they were not going to leave until Graham got the help he needed. When they arrived at the hospital, Lynn helped Graham to crawl out of the back seat where he had been lying. Then he leaned on her as he hobbled towards the sliding glass double doors that led to the emergency room. As they got closer, a nurse noticed them and ran toward them with a wheelchair. Graham was very grateful as the nurse helped him sit down, and right away he kind of slumped over in the chair. The nurse asked what was going on, and as Graham cradled his aching head, Lynn explained that her nephew was no longer able to urinate. Graham could feel the nurse speed up as she pushed him inside. Minutes later, an ER doctor explained to him that they needed to put in a catheter to relieve the pressure on his bladder. From there, they'd admit him to the hospital for treatment. A little after midnight, Lynn went in to check on Graham and found him lying awake staring up at the ceiling. She very gently squeezed his arm, and Graham yelped in pain. Lynn snapped her hand back and apologized. She had barely touched her nephew, and he had reacted like she had clamped his arm with a vice grip. Lynn told Graham she'd be right back, then went to find the doctor. The doctor came back with her to the room and then approached Graham's bedside and took a pen out of his coat pocket. He lightly ran the top of the pen along Graham's arm. And again, Graham flinched and told the doctor it really hurt when he did that. The doctor nodded and then did the same thing with the pen down Graham's legs. And as he did it, Graham winced and gritted his teeth. The doctor told Graham that the extreme sensitivity to touch was likely due to meningitis, an inflammation of the tissues that surround the brain and spinal cord. When Lynn heard this, she felt her stomach drop. If Graham did have meningitis, she knew he could spend the rest of his life battling seizures, brain damage, hearing loss, or worse. Meningitis could even be fatal. The doctor said that in order to be sure, they had to perform what's called a spinal tap. That meant he needed to insert a large needle into Graham's spine. Lynn saw Graham's face go white. She could understand why he was nervous. If even a mild touch hurt him, how would a needle going into his spine feel? But if they were going to figure out what was wrong with Graham, he would have to go through with it. Once the anesthetic was working on Graham, the doctor carefully inserted the needle in between two of Graham's vertebrae. Lynn squeezed her nephew's hand as the doctor then pulled back on the syringe and filled it with Graham's spinal fluid. After the doctor had pulled the needle out of Graham's spine, Graham relaxed and let out a sigh of relief. Lynn put on a brave face for her nephew. She was glad the procedure was over, but she had a sneaking suspicion that Graham's struggle was only just beginning. A few hours later, Graham's mother, Kay, stared in disbelief at her cell phone. While she was asleep on the other side of the world in Indonesia, she had somehow missed 2 text messages and 3 phone calls from her sister Lynn. The sisters had been texting for the past couple of days, so Kay was already aware that Graham was in the hospital, but this barrage of attempts to contact her could only mean one thing: something bad must be happening with her son. Her heart was pounding as she called her sister back, steeling herself for devastating news. When Aunt Lynn answered, she was crying. She told Kay that Graham had just tested positive for meningitis and was now fighting for his life. She needed to come home right now. It took Kay 2 full days of travel to go from the remote forests of Indonesia all the way back to Hawaii. And as soon as she landed, she hopped in a cab and went straight to the hospital. The moment she saw her sister, Lynn, waiting in the parking lot, Kay broke down in tears. Kay had spent the whole flight mentally preparing herself to see her son in the condition he was in, but she still felt totally shocked as she rounded the corner into his room and actually saw him. A tangle of wires and tubes seemed to be attached to every part of his body. He was pale and sickly looking, nothing like the healthy, tanned surfer that Kay had left a few months ago. His blonde hair was greasy and clung to his face. Graham was awake, but barely. His voice was hoarse as he said hello to his mom and gave a weak smile. Kay immediately rushed over and gave her son a hug. She promised Graham she was there to help and she would work with his doctors to make sure he got better. A few minutes later, Graham's doctor walked in and updated Kay on Graham's condition. Although they knew he had meningitis, the doctor believed it was actually a sign of a deeper underlying disease in his brain and spinal cord. One big hint was Graham's continued inability to urinate, something called Ellsberg syndrome. It really didn't make any sense that Graham could have this condition. Ellsberg syndrome is most often caused by West Nile disease, a mosquito-borne illness that has never been detected in Hawaii, and Graham had never tested positive for West Nile disease. But at least doctors could test for West Nile, which causes swelling in the brain. Other potential triggers for Ellsberg syndrome were even more devastating to the brain, but there was no test for these conditions until the disease was more advanced. So Graham's doctors were still essentially at square one. Kay just prayed they could keep her son stable long enough to find the answer. On the morning of January 12th, almost 3 weeks after Graham first got sick, Kay nodded off in the chair at the foot of her son's hospital bed. She woke up as her sister, Aunt Lynn, walked through the door with a cup of coffee in each hand. While Kay sipped her drink, she noticed her son shift a little bit. It had been almost 10 days since she'd arrived, and the doctor still didn't have a confirmed diagnosis for her son. And now her son's eyelids were fluttering rapidly, the look in his eyes seemed distant, and then when Kay stood up and shook his leg and asked if he could hear her, Graham didn't respond. Behind Kay, Aunt Lynn, who was watching this, immediately punched the call button on the wall. Seconds later, a nurse bolted into the room, ushering Kay and Lynn out of the way. The nurse took one look at the monitor tracking Graham's vital signs and began shaking Graham's leg. When he didn't respond, she went to find a doctor. Moments later, Kay held her breath as nurses ripped cords and wires out of her son and then pushed his bed as fast as they could toward the door and down the hall. As Kay watched helplessly with a look of absolute fear on her face, a nurse came over to her and gently explained that Graham had just fallen into a coma, and now he needed to be transferred to the intensive care unit. Half an hour later, a nurse escorted Kay to Graham's bedside in the ICU. Now he was hooked up to a ventilation machine just so he could breathe. A feeding tube was down his throat. Graham was on life support now. Without these machines, he would die. Graham's doctor assured Kay that Graham was stabilized for the time being, but the meningitis was only getting worse, and the Hilo Medical Center didn't have the resources to care for Graham any further. They needed to transfer him to a bigger hospital in Honolulu, the capital city of Hawaii. The medevac chopper was ready for Graham later that morning, and Kay, who was inside the chopper as well, placed a hand on her son as he lay on his stretcher, and then she watched as the helicopter lifted off the ground, and the ground below her gave way to a clear blue ocean. A short time later, Kay and Graham landed at the hospital in Honolulu, and Graham was quickly whisked away to the ICU at that hospital. By late afternoon, Kay once again watched helplessly as medical staff huddled around her gravely ill son, going over notes and trying to talk about what this could be. That night, Kay made her way to the nearby hotel that one of the nurses had recommended. But when she laid down to sleep, every time she closed her eyes, all she could see was her son lying unconscious in his hospital bed. Then she thought of the long list of drugs the doctor had prescribed for Graham, all names she couldn't remember or even begin to pronounce. They would regulate Graham's heartbeat and blood pressure and keep his organs from failing, and she knew these drugs were vital to Graham's survival. But they were also very hard on his body, putting him at risk for things like pneumonia, blood clots, and worse. And so, as Kay lay there in her hotel bed, unable to sleep, she thought to herself that she just had to find some way to help her son. She just could not sit on the sidelines anymore. And so the next morning, Kay walked into her son's room with a paper bag full of supplies. She took out a jar of noni juice, a tropical fruit with natural antioxidants, and after getting her son's doctor's permission, she fed Graham the noni through his stomach tube, hoping it would help his immune system fight off this mysterious disease. Then Kay grabbed a box of long steel pins. She lifted Graham's shirt and administered acupuncture all over Graham's stomach. Kay believed the acupuncture would protect Graham's organs, both from the disease and from any side effects of the various medications required to keep Graham alive. 2 days later, Kay moved around her son's bed, administering more acupuncture treatment, and all the while talking to him as though he could hear her. She fully believed Graham was getting better. She couldn't explain it, but it was like his presence was slowly refilling the room, and it was getting stronger and stronger with each passing day. Kay was certain that her traditional healing methods, combined with modern medicine, would help Graham's body heal. In fact, Kay was so focused on her work that morning that she barely noticed a doctor walking up behind her. He introduced himself as the hospital's infectious disease expert, and he said he had news for her, but unfortunately, it was not good news. Her son's illness had finally advanced far enough that doctors could now tell whether he was suffering from an extremely rare but utterly devastating condition. And unfortunately, the doctor said, the results came back positive. He held up an image from Graham's most recent MRI and pointed to dozens of tiny white spots on Graham's brain. He told Kay that each one of those spots represented a microscopic hole in Graham's brain tissue that were created by parasites living in his head. The doctor explained that Graham's increasingly debilitating symptoms had been caused by these parasites, called roundworm larvae, as they burrowed inside of him. Kay was so caught off guard and horrified by what she was hearing that she could barely speak for a second, but then finally she just asked, how could this happen? The doctor explained that Graham's condition is extremely rare and can only happen under very specific circumstances. These roundworm larvae, these worms, grow in the lungs of rats and then are excreted alive through the rat's feces. And then sometimes a snail will crawl over those rat feces, and the snail will become infested with these roundworm larvae as well. And if a person accidentally were to eat that infected snail or its slime, the roundworm larva can enter that person's digestive system. The doctor said that the roundworm larvae had eaten their way through Graham's intestines and eventually made their way to Graham's brain, which is what made all those microscopic holes. But it wasn't the holes that were making Graham so sick. The roundworm larvae were dying once they reached Graham's brain, and their decaying bodies were infecting the brain tissue. The condition, the doctor said, was known as rat lungworm disease. The doctor told Kay that he was terribly sorry, but he did not see a path to recovery for her son. At best, Graham would live in a vegetative state. Although his body could live, his mind would be gone. He probably would not be able to do much more than open and close his eyes. At this, Kay actually just started shaking her head. This didn't make sense to her. She was certain that Graham could hear her when she spoke to him. He had smiled when she asked him questions, like he understood what she was saying. And through her tears, Kay told the doctor that she refused to give up on her son. Over the next few weeks, Graham's condition was up and down as his body fought off several dangerous infections. Kay trusted all the doctor's abilities, but she just felt like Western medicine alone would not actually be able to help Graham. And so, in between drug treatments to fight off the parasites in Graham's body, Kay gave her son supplements of herbs like spirulina, chlorella, and a Chinese herb called Xing Nao Wan. She had heard these treatments helped with nerve function, and she hoped they might allow Graham to recover faster. Kay also continued feeding her son noni juice and continued giving him acupuncture. And through all of Kay's treatments, her son's eyes would periodically open and close. But the doctors told Kay that it was just a reflex and not something he was doing consciously. Then, one day in March, Kay noticed that Graham's eyes became more animated. It seemed like they were focusing on her. Kay immediately pressed the call button, and soon Graham's doctor came in, and he confirmed that it did look like Graham was starting to wake up. Kay held her son's hand and encouraged him to make a noise, do something, make some sign that he was still there. For a while, the only sound Graham made was his labored breathing. But Kay kept at it, constantly asking her son to give some sign, and then kind of as a joke, she would say to her son, as his labored breathing continued, that he sounded like Darth Vader. And when she said that, Graham's eyes seemed to focus again, and he took what looked like a big deep breath, and then in a very weak voice, he said, "Luke, I am your father." Kay almost screamed with excitement. Not only was her son awake, he could speak. She reached down to hug him, and amazingly, Graham hugged her back. The doctors who were watching this were just as amazed as Kay was. Kay liked to think that her treatments had helped support the vital work the doctors had done to keep her son alive. Together, they'd done everything in their power to give Graham's body a fighting chance against this parasite, and against all odds, he had overcome it. Within a few days, Graham was conscious enough for his mother to explain what had happened to him and how he had gotten this terrible disease from a snail. Graham asked how that could possibly be, because he could not recall eating any snails, and his mother kind of shrugged and said, we may never know for sure how this happened. But she then told her son that most likely, on the night that he had that potluck dinner on Christmas Eve, when he harvested the kale, perhaps there was a snail on the kale that had this disease in it. When she said that, Graham's mouth fell open in shock. He thought back to that night and the bunches of kale he hastily gathered from their garden, and he'd been in such a rush to head out the door, he had forgotten to wash the kale. And so had there been an infected snail or infected snail slime on this kale, it's totally possible that Graham could have accidentally ingested it. Thankfully, nobody else at the potluck had gotten sick. On April 30th, after more than 4 months in the hospital, Graham was finally able to return home. Over the next 2 years, he relearned how to walk and talk. Today, he rides his bike to a local community college, where he's studying to become a physical therapist. teenager named Eben and his father would regularly go hunting in the Georgia backcountry. When Eben turned 14, his father befriended a very wealthy landowner in Georgia who offered them access to one of his best private hunting areas. And just a couple of days later, on October 5th, Eben and his father would take him up on the offer. They woke up super early and they drove out to the edge of this property that was actually fenced in. And they went to a main gate where they had the combo that this guy had given them. They punched in the combo, opened up the gate, drove in, shut the gate, locked it, and then continued down the access road. They followed this road for about 2 miles where it came to a stop right outside of this huge forest. They parked their truck, they got out, they put on their gear, and in the pre-morning darkness began hiking into the woods. Even though they were there primarily to hunt, Eben and his father secretly enjoyed just hiking around the woods and camping out, and any chance they got to extend their hunting trips, they would, even if the hunting wasn't good. And so since they spent a ton of time in the woods together, they noticed almost immediately when they walked into this particular forest that something was off. There's no birds, there's no animals. Silence. It's just totally silent. The only sounds they heard that were not them was a single plane that passed overhead. Although they found this very odd, they figured, you know what, this is private property, not a lot of people are out here. I'm sure as soon as we showed up, the animals were aware of us and they've scattered. They finally make it out to the hunting stand that the owner had told them about. They get all settled in, they're getting ready to see some animals. And all day long, they don't see a single animal. They don't hear a single animal. In fact, again, it is just completely silent. Frustrated, they began packing up their stuff, making their way down off the stand, and they started looking for a place to make camp for the night. And Eben's father suggested, well, hey, there's obviously nothing over here. It's been quiet all day. Why don't we walk deeper into the woods a little ways, set up camp there, so tomorrow we have a better chance of seeing some animals. So they hiked for about an hour farther away from where they parked their truck, and they reached this clearing, which is perfect for setting up their camp. And so they set up their tent, and Eben's father says, hey, we still got some daylight. Do you want to go try our luck and see if we can see some animals out here now? Eben's like, yeah, why not? So they hike a little ways away from their campsite and they set up their blind, and once again, they don't see any animals. It's totally quiet. And so they turn around and they start heading back. As soon as they could see their campsite, which really was just their tent, they noticed that their tent was now collapsed. And Eben's father turns to him and says, oh, it must have been the wind. And Eben says, no, it couldn't have been the wind, because all day today we have been commenting on how quiet it is and how the fact that there's no weather, no wind, no anything is heightening the fact that it's completely silent. So it could not have been wind. So Eben's father is like, well, when you set the tent up, did you not put the posts into the eyelets? Did you not build it correctly? And Eben's like, no, I've made that tent like 1,000 times. I know it was set up correctly. They walk into their campsite and they look down at their tent, and they're really confused at what they see. The 2 rods that go in an X over the top of the tent that thread through nylon loops and then anchor at 4 different points on the base of the tent, well, they had been removed from the 4 corners. And if you know how a tent works, it works on tension. And once you have a rod anchored in 2 points, it doesn't just pop out. It's anchored at 2 sides. It's actually difficult to remove each anchor. Once one is out, the other comes out easily. But basically, the rod would need to break in order for it to come out of those anchor points, or someone would have to come over and remove it. And they didn't remove them, and none of the rods were broken. Which leaves them with either they failed to set up their tent, even though they had distinct and clear memories of setting it up and double checking it was set up because they put gear inside of it, or someone came over to their campsite while they were gone and undid the 4 corners. They decide, you know what, it can't be some stranger coming over here because we're the only ones with the gate combo. This is private property and no one could have been here. And why would they do that if they came to our campsite? Why would they randomly collapse our tent and then vanish? So it had to be us. We must have not made the tent. And while they didn't really believe that they had not made their tent, they convinced themselves that that's what happened because the alternative was just too bizarre and frankly terrifying to consider. So they build their tent and they make a little fire and they stay up for a little while chatting before being tired and saying, okay, let's just go to bed. They extinguish the fire, they get in the tent, and they both fall asleep. A couple hours later, Eben wakes up suddenly and he's not sure if he's dreaming or not, but he thinks he hears someone laughing a couple hundred meters behind their tent off in the woods. Eben instinctively turns to make sure his dad is still in the tent with him, and he is. And then Eben starts listening really intently to what's happening outside. and all he can hear is silence, like it's been since they got in the woods. He doesn't hear any more laughter, and so he says, okay, I must have just been dreaming, and there wasn't any laughter out there, and eventually Eben goes back to sleep. A little while later, Eben wakes up suddenly again, except this time his dad is already awake and looking around anxiously. And Eben sits up and goes, what's going on? And his dad goes, shh. And he goes, can you hear that? And Eben listens, and to his horror, he hears laughing. He wasn't dreaming before. Eben also realizes the laughter is not coming from the same area he heard it. It's now coming from the opposite direction, and it's a lot closer to them. Eben very quietly and carefully explains to his dad that he actually heard this laughter a couple hours earlier. And Eben's father turns to Eben and says, before we came out here, I asked the owner, should we expect any other hunters or campers or anybody nearby? And the owner said, this is private property and it's fenced in. There is no one there but you guys. After this revelation, they both turn their attention back to just listening because they're hoping this is just going to stop and whatever this is just going to leave. But it doesn't leave. They hear footsteps running towards them from way off in the forest, and it's so quiet, it's really easy to hear these footsteps. And whatever this is charging towards them. And then it comes to a complete stop right at the edge of their clearing. At this point, Eben is now grabbing onto his father. Eben's father is holding onto his rifle, and he's getting ready to open the tent to confront whatever is out there. And right before he grabs the zipper, this person, whatever it is, starts laughing again, and it's practically right on top of them. It's so loud. They can hear it clear as day right there, right outside their tent. And Eben's father takes a deep breath. He grabs the zipper, and as soon as he begins moving it, the sound the zipper made causes the laughter to stop. They don't hear footsteps, so they know probably something's still out there. But the laughter stops like it's recognized that they're making noise. They're right there. There they are. They're in the tent. Eben's father freezes with his hand on this zipper, and he's debating whether he should go outside or not. And before he can even make that decision, whatever this thing is turns around and runs back into the woods, and it's just gone. And for several minutes, they just sit like that in total silence, praying that whatever this is gone for good. And after several minutes, when they don't hear anything, there's no more laughing, there's no more running, Eben's father re-zips up the tent, puts his hand back down, and they're both left just sitting there thinking, what the heck just happened? Eben and his father would stay up all night, and they would barely speak, because whatever this thing was had heard them when they moved the zipper. And so they were really afraid of making any sound, even little sounds, because it's so quiet, sound travels really far, and they don't know who or what is out there. And so in silence, holding their guns, they're just waiting for the sun to come up. And as soon as it did, they were up and out of there, literally running out of the forest, checking over their shoulder the whole time, all the way back to their truck. And so to this day, they have no idea who or what the heck was running around out there. And they told the owner of the property about it. And the owner just said, it's not possible. We have a totally gated in private piece of property, and there are cameras watching the only entrance. And you are the only ones that went in or out over that time period. And prior to that, we monitor this property. Nobody else was in there. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Katie and her father decided to go camping at one of their favorite campgrounds in the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Katie loved going camping with her father because he was this totally accomplished outdoorsman, and he used to be a wilderness guide for much of his life, and so she just always felt like she was in great hands whenever she was out in the wild with him, and she had kind of become a fairly accomplished outdoorswoman herself. When they arrived at the campground, the parking lot was packed with cars, and they're like, shoot, I wish we'd called ahead a couple weeks ago and reserved a site because they're probably not even available now. But they went to the front desk and they were like, you're in luck, we have one available, but it's the one that's way over there. It was this one campsite that was kind of isolated from the rest of the campground. It was far away from the bathhouse, it was far away from where you go swimming, and it was far away from the parking lot. It was just like really inconvenient. And whenever they came camping here, it was like the one site they didn't want to use. But beggars can't be choosers. They were happy to even have a site. And so they drove all the way down this little road into this very isolated campsite, kind of in the middle of this forest. Once they got there, they began setting up their respective tents because they were not going to be staying in the same tent. They each had these very small backpacking tents, which were so small that you could either zip it up all the way and stay warmer and more protected, but you had to sleep in a ball because your legs would not fit otherwise. Or you could unzip the front of your tent, and when you lay down, you could extend your legs fully, but your legs are protruding outside of your tent. So you could only do that in warmer weather and if you were comfortable having your legs poking out into the wilderness. After they set up their tents and they get their coolers set up and they have all their stuff kind of the way they want it, they go out hiking for the rest of the day. When they come back, they're totally exhausted, they fall asleep, and nothing of note occurs over that first night. The next day they get up, they go back out, they go hiking all day all over again, and they come back that night and they are totally exhausted again. And they get into their tents and they go to bed. And this night, something of note would happen. At about 3 a.m., Katie wakes up and she hears footsteps walking towards the campsite from a little ways off. They're in the woods somewhere. And she's thinking, okay, it's got to be my father because he's diabetic and every night he gets up to go to the bathroom maybe 3-4 times, and he probably was just walking to the bathhouse and now he's walking back. But she realizes the bathhouse is over here, not over here. So what is he doing walking towards the campsite from this side? The footsteps come out of the tree line, they come into the clearing that is their campsite, and they stop about 2-3 meters outside of Katie's tent. Now there were no windows on Katie's backpack tent, there was just little vents at the front and the back that kind of pointed down, and so she couldn't see out anyways, and there was no illumination out, so you can't even pick up a silhouette. It's just total darkness out there, she can't see who's out there, she can only hear them. But she's thinking, okay, maybe my dad got lost coming back from the bathhouse because he didn't have a flashlight and he walked too far. That's possible. Or, he could have decided to relieve himself just in the tree line, even though he's not known to do that. He's a guy that goes to the bathhouse. And so she's running through these scenarios that are convincing her that, oh, that's just my dad. But what she really wants to hear is that person walk away from her tent and get into her father's tent, because that will confirm in her mind that that was her father. And so she's sitting here waiting for that confirmation, and she hears the footsteps again, but instead of walking around her tent to her father's tent, this person walks right up against her tent very quickly. And they clearly begin leaning over her little tiny tent because she can hear them breathing right above her. And this is when she realizes, that's not my dad. And as she's having this terrible revelation that some stranger is outside her tent right now, she has an even worse revelation. It was a warm night that night, so she was sleeping with her tent unzipped and her legs poking out the end. She musters the courage to begin slowly retracting her legs back inside of her tent. But before she's able to do that, this person stands up, turns, and starts walking towards the base of her tent where her legs are. She's completely frozen and terrified about what's about to happen. But this person doesn't stop at her feet. They keep moving and in fact start circling her tent. But because they were making a lot of noise and walking around her, it allowed her to pull her legs back into her tent without, this person hearing her. And so she had the illusion of safety being inside of her tent, but her tent is still unzipped. So she's waiting for this person to come around and crouch down and look inside of her tent because it's open. And so she's just looking down there hoping that doesn't happen. But unfortunately, right at this moment, the person walked to the base of her tent and came to a stop right outside where the opening to the tent is. And so she's sitting there thinking, please don't come in here, please don't come in here, please don't come in here. And even though her feet are pulled up into her tent, she suddenly feels something pinch her foot, and she knows it's a hand. Something has grabbed my foot. And she stifles a scream and she starts shaking uncontrollably because her instincts are telling her, don't let this person know you're awake. And luckily, as she's sitting there shaking from fear and trying to be quiet as best as she can, she's holding her mouth, this person stands back up again and goes back to the spot next to her tent and leans over the tent once again, and she can hear them breathing right over her. And so for several minutes, she lay there shaking with this random person who pinched her foot a minute ago, hovering over her tent in the middle of the night. And she has nothing she can do. And she's just quiet. She's hoping it's going to end soon. And eventually this person would turn around and walk over to their cooler and their table and some other things that were out. And she hears some rummaging going on. Some things are being moved around. And then this person just kind of walks off into the distance. But she doesn't know if they're gone. She doesn't know if they're standing in the edge of the tree line waiting for her to come outside. Maybe they laid a trap for her. And so she just lays there, silent, doesn't move, and she's praying to herself, please don't let anything happen to me or my father. And all night she's just laying there. And then eventually she does fall asleep. Probably hours go by, but she does fall asleep because she wakes up again when she hears her father unzipping his tent, and she charges out to meet him. And she can tell right away that he's scared. And before she can even say or begin to describe what's happened to her, he says, were you outside your tent last night at about 2-3 in the morning? Because I heard all sorts of commotion near our cooler. I wasn't sure if it was an animal. I wasn't sure if it was you. And she starts telling him, no, this is what happened to me. And as she's describing what happened to her, he looks behind her at the picnic table, which was next to their cooler, and they had their backpacks on it. Basically anything that didn't fit in their tents they kept near this picnic table. And he points at it, and she turns around, and any item that was in the cooler or in their backpacks or that was just out has been stacked in a pyramid formation on this table. Clearly, the guy who was here last night did this for some reason they don't understand. And as they go over to look at it to see if anything's been taken, they notice this track of footprints, like these heavy footprints that have been going around and around Katie's tent. So she clearly wasn't imagining it. And so that instant, they packed everything up, got in their car, and they left. And to this day, they can barely talk about it with each other because it's all the things that could have happened. The father felt horribly guilty because he clearly heard this person but didn't leave his tent. And his daughter was clearly in danger. And his daughter's thinking, the tent was open. This person was crouched down, reaching into my tent, grabbing my feet. Like, that's such a horrifying image. And so this has been completely traumatizing for them, and they just don't talk about it anymore. From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was two others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned, because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist, there's vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and grass is growing all through them, and so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room table still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, like, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling is totally sagging down. And the first floor is buckling completely, and there's clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation that this is no museum, these are abandoned, we can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable. And they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they found. And their father was like, man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out. And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit looking one where the ceiling was sagging and there was women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These are definitely abandoned. So they look at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they go inside and they go upstairs and they find this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, is totally intact. You got pictures on the wall, it's fully furnished. There's even still sheets made on the bed, in the pillow. It's got a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed is this beautiful fur coat. And the father walks over to it and he looks at it and he's like, this is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family. But before he took it, he had a hesitation. Is this really abandoned? You know, if someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house just because there's grime all over the ground, and they can clearly see their footprints from where they've just come in. And he's like, no, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned, and finders keepers. And so he picks up the jacket and he says, I'm gonna give this to mom after I clean it up. And so with the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explore the rest of the house. And when they go outside, they realize it's starting to get late and it's probably time to head back. And so they turn around and they start walking away from these houses towards their cabin. And they get about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turns around and he's shocked when he sees there is an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in, where the fur coat was. She's got a loose bun on the top of her head. She's got this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she's glaring at them. When the kid saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was guilt. They're like, oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house. And so right away, the whole group starts walking right back towards the house. They're gonna give this jacket back. In fact, the dad is like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken this. I'm sorry. And as they're walking back towards the property, the woman in the window who hasn't said anything just turns around and walks back into the main part of the house. They can't see her anymore. And so as they're walking closer to the house, they're assuming she's going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they get right up to the front door, and the father is yelling to her, I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it into you. And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs, and she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids don't really know what to do, and they're kind of getting uneasy about the situation. And the father is still very confident that he just wants to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he's sorry. And so he walks inside. He tells his kids, stay here, I'm gonna go give it to her. And he goes inside and he disappears upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street in that decrepit house with the caved in ceiling, they hear one of the second floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad comes charging down the stairs, no jacket with him, and he's saying, go, go, go. And the kids are spooked from the window getting slammed, and they start running away until they're about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stop and they're panting and they're out of breath. And the kids ask their dad, what happened? And he says to them, I looked everywhere upstairs and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something, but I happened to be looking out at that other house. Something caught my eye. There was movement, and I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window, and then as soon as I did, I heard someone yell, get out. And I ran out after you guys. Now the kids and the dad are absolutely terrified and they want to leave, but they also want one more look at these buildings before they do. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view to the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they begin to peek their heads around the tree until they can see the building, and they can't believe what they see. Standing in the window of the fur coat room is not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who's holding her shoulders and is bending down because his head is too high to look standing. He's crouched down and he's looking out the window next to her, and they're both glaring towards them. The father and his kids are practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there. And so they'll never get any answers because everything's gone. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of